The first time Avery Hale heard the words royal trial spoken with her name behind them, she understood that truth was not the thing they were gathering to find. It was still dark beneath Moonspire Court, the kind of dark that lived in servant corridors long after the upper windows had begun to catch the first silver edge of dawn, and Avery stood with both hands in a basin of cold water pretending the tremor in her fingers came from the chill. It did not. The water was cold, yes, cold enough to turn her knuckles pale and make the thin skin at her wrists ache, but she had scrubbed linens in winter before, had carried buckets across frozen courtyards before, had slept in a room where the stone floor held the February cold like a grudge. This was different. This was the body learning something before the mind was ready to name it. Above her, somewhere past 3 flights of narrow stairs and 1 locked iron door, the royal court was waking in layers, kitchen bells, guard boots, the soft rush of maids carrying coal, the distant opening of shutters in rooms Avery had cleaned but never been invited to look out from. Moonspire always sounded gentle before it became cruel. That was one of the first things she had learned after being brought here at 11 years old with no pack crest, no family record, and no explanation anyone cared to repeat twice. A place could be beautiful and still teach you to keep your eyes down. The night before, she had been returning folded napkins to the east pantry when she heard her name through the council chamber door. Not loudly. Loud voices would have given her something to brace against. These were quiet voices, careful voices, the kind used by people who believed stone walls existed to protect them from witnesses. Evidence, one man had said. Witnesses, another answered. Blood debt. Royal theft. Execution clause. Then Lord Gideon Voss, whose polished boots Avery recognized before she ever dared recognize his face, had spoken in a tone so calm it made every word feel already decided. The maid is convenient. No one will question it. Avery had stood there with a stack of white linen pressed against her chest until the folded edges left faint lines through her dress. She had not dropped the napkins. She had not run. Servants who ran became stories by breakfast. So she had stepped backward 1 careful inch at a time, returned the linen to its shelf, and walked to her narrow bed beneath the laundry stairs, as though the shape of her life had not just changed behind a closed door. Now, with dawn thinning the darkness and the basin water growing cloudy around her hands, a brass bell rang once from the upper hall. Not the kitchen bell. Not the chapel bell. The summons bell. Avery lifted her head. In the doorway, Mrs. Calder, the head housekeeper, stood with her grey shawl pinned tight at her throat and pity arranged on her face in a way that frightened Avery more than anger would have. "They are ready for you," she said. Avery dried her hands slowly on the towel beside the basin. The fabric was rough, worn thin from years of washing, and she focused on that small ordinary scratch against her skin, because everything else in the room had begun to feel too far away. "For what?" she asked, though she already knew questions did not belong to girls like her. Mrs. Calder looked past her, toward the stairs. "The royal trial." The words settled between them like frost. Avery looked down at her plain brown dress, at the damp cuffs, at the tiny white scar beneath her collarbone where the skin always seemed colder than the rest of her. For 1 foolish second, she thought of asking whether she should change. Then she almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the thought was so small beside what was coming. They had not called her to be seen. They had called her to be buried neatly, publicly, and with witnesses. So Avery straightened her cuffs, lifted her chin just enough to remember she had won, and followed the housekeeper up the stairs toward the court that had already decided what a worthless maid was worth. Avery had been taught that a servant could survive almost anything if she learned the exact size of the space she was allowed to occupy. In Moonspire Court, that space was narrow enough to fit between a wall and a passing noble, small enough to disappear behind a tray, quiet enough to be mistaken for furniture until something spilled, tore, burned, or went missing. She had learned it young, at 11, when the winter carriage left her at the servants' gate with a bundle of plain clothes, a paper bearing no family seal, and a matron who looked at her pale face and said, "Another stray." No one had asked whether she remembered a mother. No one had asked whether she belonged to a pack. The absence of an answer had been treated as an answer by itself. In the years that followed, Avery became useful in the way invisible things were useful. She rose before 5 in the morning to shake ash from fireplaces, still breathing last night's smoke. She carried pitchers of hot water upstairs that turned her calves to stone. She polished the silver wolves on banquet knives until her reflection appeared in their curved backs, small and warped and easier to ignore. She hemmed gowns for women who spoke over her head, and mended gloves for men who dropped them at her feet without looking down. Moonspire Court was full of beautiful things, and Avery touched nearly all of them without ever being allowed to own anything more delicate than a needle. The first time Marissa Vale called her worthless, it had been in the Rose Parlor during a spring luncheon. Avery had been 17, and had placed the tea service half an inch too close to a vase of white lilies. Nothing had broken. Nothing had spilled. But Marissa, already famous for her pearl gowns and perfect posture, had looked at the other young ladies and smiled as if she had found a private joke too charming to keep. "Some girls have wolf blood," she had said. "Some girls have mop water." The room had laughed softly, politely, the way well-bred people laughed when cruelty arrived wrapped in silk. Avery had lowered her eyes and moved the tray. That was the answer Moonspire preferred from her. No defense. No tears. No proof that the words had landed. Over time, the insult changed shape, but never disappeared. Worthless maid. Packless girl. Quiet little nothing. A servant without a wolf was pitied. A servant without a wolf and without a name was useful, because pity lasted only until there was work to be done. Her wolf, if she had one, stayed buried so deep inside her that sometimes Avery wondered whether the silence in her chest was proof of absence, or proof of something hiding from danger. The healers had examined her once, when she was 14, after Mrs. Calder noticed the pale mark beneath her collarbone. It was not large then, only a thin crescent of lighter skin that never warmed under blankets, and never faded in summer. The old healer touched it, went still for one breath too long, then told the housekeeper it was only an old scar. After that, no one mentioned it again, but Avery had noticed how certain doors closed faster when she carried linens past them, and how Lord Gideon Voss sometimes looked at her as though she were a mistake that had not yet become inconvenient enough to correct. By the time she reached the upper landing behind Mrs. Calder that morning, the court bells were ringing in measured intervals, each note traveling through the stone like a command. Servants stepped aside as Avery passed. Not cruelly. That would have been easier. They looked at her with the careful sympathy of people grateful not to be standing where she stood. Avery kept her hands folded at her waist, damp cuffs hidden beneath her palms, and walked toward the great doors at the end of the hall. Beyond them waited nobles, witnesses, evidence, and whatever story had been prepared for her. She thought of Marissa's voice, bright and soft as a silver blade. She thought of the word worthless, repeated so many times it should have become dull by now. It had not. It had only become familiar. And familiarity, Avery had learned, was not the same as surrender. Just before Avery reached the great doors, a young guard stepped into the hall, and said her name as if he wished someone else had been ordered to do it. He could not have been more than 20, with a uniform too stiff at the shoulders and a face carefully emptied of opinion. Mrs. Calder stopped beside her, one hand tightening around the edge of her grey shawl. Lord Voss requested the maid be brought through the East Records passage first, the guard said. Requested was the word people used in Moonspire Court, when refusal was not one of The available shapes a sentence could take. Avery felt the hallway alter around her. Not visibly. The same torches burned in their iron brackets. The same pale runners lay across the stone floor. The same carved wolves watched from the beams overhead, mouths open in silent warning. But something in the morning had shifted half an inch to the left, and every instinct she had spent years teaching herself to ignore turned its head. Mrs. Calder did not argue. Servants did not argue with guards, and guards did not argue with men like Lord Gideon Voss. So Avery followed him away from the great doors and into a narrower corridor where the walls sweated cold and the air smelled of old paper, lamp oil, and dust that had settled in places no maid was trusted to clean without supervision. The East Records passage ran behind the council chambers, a place Avery had entered only twice in her life, both times carrying sealed boxes under the eyes of a clerk who counted her footsteps, as if each one cost the crown money. Today there was no clerk. That was the first wrong thing. The second was the door standing open at the end of the passage, its brass handle turned inward, a strip of yellow light falling across the floor. The guard stopped outside it. "You are to wait inside," he said. Avery looked at him. He looked at the wall behind her. Pity again. Thin, nervous, useless pity. She stepped into the room. It was smaller than she remembered, lined with shelves that reached nearly 8 feet high, each one crowded with ledgers, ribboned bundles, and narrow boxes labeled in careful black ink. A single lamp burned on the desk. Beside it sat a silver tray Avery recognized from the south pantry, the kind used for morning chocolate in the royal apartments. On the tray lay a folded square of white linen. For 1 second, Avery thought it was only a napkin. Then she saw the stain at the corner, brown-red and dried dark into the weave, and beneath it a knot of blue thread tied in a servant's loop. Her servant's loop. The kind Mrs. Calder required from every laundry girl, so linens could be traced back to the hands that handled them. Avery did not touch it. That was the important thing. She folded her hands behind her back until her fingers locked together and forced herself to look, not reach. The thread was blue, yes, but too clean. Her own thread had been faded by years of lye soap and hard water. This one was bright, almost new, the color of a ribbon pulled from a sewing basket, and made to pretend it had worked for a living. On the desk beside the tray, half hidden under a ledger, lay something smaller, a sliver of black wax stamped with the edge of a crescent seal. Avery knew that seal. Every servant in Moonspire knew it. It marked the private correspondence of Lord Gideon Voss. Her mouth went dry, but her mind became strangely clear. This was not evidence someone had found. This was a little stage, arranged in a quiet room, waiting for her to step close enough to become part of it. Footsteps sounded in the passage behind her. 2 sets, heavier than the young guards. Avery looked once more at the linen, at the wax, at the too bright thread, and understood with a clean, cold certainty that whatever waited in the trial chamber had been prepared long before dawn. They did not need her guilty. They only needed her close enough to the lie. The 2 guards who entered did not look at the tray. That told Avery more than any accusation could have. One stood by the door, the other gestured toward the passage with a politeness so thin it might have cut if she still had room left to be surprised. "The court is waiting," he said. Avery let her hands fall to her sides and walked out, before either of them could decide she needed to be pulled along. There was dignity in going where they had arranged for her to go, if only because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. The East Records passage opened into the rear of the great hall through a narrow arch servants used during winter ceremonies, and the moment Avery stepped beneath it, the size of the room struck her like weather. She had cleaned this hall after feasts, had swept pine needles from its corners after solstice banquets, had polished spilled wine from the black stone floor on her knees while nobles slept late above her. But she had never entered it like this, with every chair filled, every eye lifted, every candle flame seeming to hold itself still to watch. The royal court had been arranged in 3 rising tiers around the central floor. On the lowest level sat the witnesses and household officers. Above them were the visiting alphas from 12 territories, their crests sewn in silver, red, green, and deep blue against formal coats that probably cost more than every dress Avery had owned in her life. Highest of all sat the elders beneath the carved moon arch, pale chains resting on their chests, faces composed into the kind of solemnity that made mercy look unlikely. At the center of the floor stood a small table draped in white cloth. Upon it rested a covered object no larger than a bread box, guarded by 2 men in black uniforms. Avery did not need anyone to tell her it mattered. The whole room seemed to be breathing around it. Marissa Vale stood near the council rail in a pearl-colored gown, her blonde hair pinned beneath a circlet of moonstones that caught the light every time she tilted her head. She did not smile when Avery entered. Smiling would have been too obvious. Instead she looked briefly down, as though embarrassed on Avery's behalf, and somehow that was worse. Lord Gideon Voss stood beside the elders with a leather folder held against his ribs. His face was smooth, patient, almost kind. Only his right thumb moved, pressing once against the folder's edge, when he saw Avery looking at him. Then the sound changed. It did not grow louder. It left. The last murmur folded into silence. The guards at the door straightened before the herald announced anything. One of the alphas in the second tier lowered his eyes. A candle at the far end of the hall bent sideways, though no draft touched Avery's skin. The great doors opened, and Rowan Sterling entered as if the room had been built around the expectation of his arrival. He wore no crown. That was the first thing Avery noticed, and somehow it made him seem more dangerous to the shape of the court, not less. His dark coat was cut simply, fastened at the throat with a silver wolf clasp, and a black mantle fell from one shoulder without ornament except for the royal sigil worked into the fabric in thread, so dark it appeared only when the light chose it. He was tall, but height was not what made the nobles sit smaller. It was the quiet that moved ahead of him. It was the way men who ruled valleys and forests watched his hands before they watched his face. It was the way Lord Gideon stopped moving his thumb. Rowan crossed the hall without hurry, each step measured against the stone, and Avery felt something in her chest answer the sound with a pressure she did not understand. He passed the covered relic, past Marissa, past the elders, and took his place behind the high table. Only then did he look at the accused servant standing alone on the floor below him. His eyes were grey, not soft, not cruel, but clear in a way that made lies seem suddenly badly dressed. Avery lowered her gaze, because servants lowered their gaze before kings. "Look at me," Rowan said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Avery looked up. For less than a second, something crossed his face, so fast no one else might have seen it. Recognition, perhaps, though that was impossible. Not pity. Not anger. Something older than either. Then it was gone, sealed behind the calm expression of a king who had learned long ago that a room full of wolves would mistake any open feeling for permission. Rowan turned his attention to Lord Gideon. "Begin," he said, and the single word landed across the hall like a door closing. Lord Gideon opened the leather folder, as if every page inside had been placed there by truth itself. He did not rush. Men like him never rushed when a room already belonged to their version of events. The first paper he lifted made a soft sound between his fingers, and Avery, standing alone on the polished black stone, found herself noticing the smallest things, because the larger things had become too much to hold at once. The uneven hem of her left cuff, the scent of beeswax from the candles, the way Marissa's moonstones threw pale dots of light across the council rail. This court has convened to examine the disappearance and contamination of the royal Moon Relic, Gideon said. His voice carried perfectly, smooth as cream poured over something bitter. A sacred object entrusted to the crown, bound to the royal bloodline, and protected under the laws of Moonspire since the first Lunar's reign. Avery kept her eyes on the white draped table. The covered object beneath the cloth seemed smaller now and somehow more dangerous, not because of what it was, but because of what people had decided it could make true. Gideon continued, naming dates, corridors, storage seals, witness statements. Each word fitted neatly beside the next until the lie began to resemble architecture. He said Avery had entered the East Wing without permission. He said a linen bearing her servant's thread had been recovered near the relic chamber. He said traces of unauthorized handling had been found on the sacred covering. He did not say she had been sent to the records passage. He did not say the thread was too bright. He did not say his own crescent seal had rested in wax beside the staged evidence. Truth, Avery realized, could be removed from a story without changing its grammar. The first witness was a pantry maid named Lila, who had once shared dried apples with Avery during a snowstorm, when the kitchen roof leaked for 3 days. Lila would not look at her. She spoke toward the elders and said she had seen Avery near the East Hall after evening bells. That was true. Avery had been returning napkins. Gideon thanked her, as if she had offered something noble instead of something frightened and incomplete. The second witness was the young guard from the corridor. He said Avery had been found in the records room with suspicious linen in plain sight. Also true, if truth could be cut into pieces and arranged like cold meat on a plate. The third was Marissa. She walked forward with her hands folded lightly at her waist, her pearl gown whispering over the floor. I have no wish to speak harshly of a servant, she began, which meant she had every intention of doing exactly that. But I have seen this girl linger near objects above her station. The lunar circlet. The old portraits. The royal archives. Sometimes longing becomes confusion. Sometimes confusion becomes entitlement. A few soft murmurs moved through the room. Avery felt them touch her skin more sharply than open scorn would have. Entitlement. The word was almost elegant. It made hunger sound like theft. It made a girl looking at a portrait sound like a crime. Rowan Sterling had not moved during the testimony. His hands rested on the high table, still and unadorned except for one silver signet ring. His face gave the court nothing. Yet when Marissa spoke the word entitlement, his gaze shifted, not to Marissa, but to Avery. She felt it and hated that she felt it, because no king's attention had ever protected a servant for long. Does the accused deny entering the East Wing? Gideon asked. Avery swallowed once. Her throat felt lined with dust. No, she said. Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted, but it did not break. I was sent there with linens. By whom? Gideon asked gently. The gentleness was the trap. Mrs. Calder stood among the household officers, face pale, lips pressed tight. The young guard looked down. Every person who could answer had already learned the cost of being useful to her. Avery understood then that the trial was not built only from lies. It was built from fear, polished until it could pass for order. She lifted her chin and said, I do not know who gave the order. But I know who placed the evidence. The hall changed. Not loudly. A breath held here, a shoulder stiffened there. Gideon's smile did not move, but something behind it closed. A serious claim, he said. From a girl with no name, no pack record, and no awakened wolf to speak on her behalf. There it was, laid before the court like the final proof. Not what she had done. What she was. Avery felt the old familiar word forming in the room before anyone said it. Worthless. She folded her damp cuffs beneath her palms and stood straight inside the silence that wanted her small. The elder seated beneath the carved moon arch leaned forward with the slow care of a man who had spent a lifetime letting silence make other people nervous. His hair was white, his hands narrow, and the chain across his chest carried 7 small silver moons, each one polished bright enough to catch the candlelight. Avery Hale, he said, as though her name were an object he had been given only because no better label existed. You have heard the testimony. You have challenged the integrity of this court. Before judgment proceeds, do you offer proof of your claim? Avery looked at the faces arranged above her. Alphas with guarded eyes. Ladies with gloved fingers resting over their mouths. Household officers who had known her since childhood and now seemed uncertain whether remembering that was safe. Proof. It was a beautiful word when spoken by people who owned records, seals, witnesses, and rooms where their voices were believed before they were tested. Avery had a damp cuff, a cold scar, and the memory of black wax on a desk where she had been meant to touch the wrong thing. No, she said. The word was small, but it was honest. A stir passed through the court, soft as fabric drawn over stone. Marissa lowered her eyes for half a second, and the corner of her mouth curved with careful sadness. Then perhaps, she said, the court should stop indulging a servant's fantasy. Rowan's gaze moved to her. Marissa lowered her chin at once, but she had already placed the sentence where she wanted it. Gideon sighed, almost regretfully. There is one final measure available under royal law. If the accused claims the evidence was planted, let the relic itself answer. It rejects false hands. It recognizes only those permitted by moon blood, royal oath, or sanctioned guardianship. The oldest elder frowned. That measure is rarely used. Because it is rarely needed, Gideon replied. But the girl has accused this council of corruption. Let us be thorough. Thorough. Avery thought of the linen staged beneath lamplight. She thought of the young guard who could not meet her eyes. She thought of Mrs. Calder's pale face in the officer rows and the way fear turned decent people into locked doors. The black uniformed guards uncovered the object on the white table. The royal moon relic was not as grand as Avery expected. It was a shallow silver bowl, no wider than 10 inches across, with a crescent rising from its center like a frozen ribbon of moonlight. Symbols circled the rim, too old for her to read, though her eyes caught on one shape again. And again, a small crown nestled inside a curve of moon. Her scar went cold beneath her collar. Not the ordinary cold of stone corridors or winter laundry. A deep, inward cold, as if something sleeping under her skin had opened its eyes. Place your hand upon the rim, Gideon said. His voice remained gentle. That was how Avery knew he expected this to end exactly as he had planned. A few nobles shifted closer. Someone whispered worthless Maid from the second tier, not loudly enough to be named, only loudly enough to be heard. Another breath of laughter followed, polite and brief and more humiliating than a shout would have been. Avery did not look toward it. She looked at the bowl. Then at Rowan. His face was still, but his right hand had tightened around the edge of the high table. It was the first uncontrolled thing she had seen him do. She does not have to be handled like a spectacle, he said. Gideon bowed his head. Of course, Your Majesty. She need only touch it. Avery understood then that refusing would become guilt, and obeying might become whatever Gideon had prepared. There was no clean door out of the room. Only the next step. She walked to the table. The hall seemed to lengthen around her, every foot of black stone stretching like a road across a frozen lake. She lifted her hand. Her fingers were pale, chapped from soap, the nails cut short, because long nails tore under laundry work. Nothing about that hand looked royal. Nothing about it looked dangerous. She placed it on the silver rim. The relic did not burn. It did not reject her. It went utterly, impossibly cold. The candles nearest the table bent inward. A thin line of silver light appeared beneath Avery's skin at her wrist, delicate as thread, then moved upward in slow, luminous branches. A sound passed through the room, not speech, not prayer, but recognition before anyone was ready to confess it. Avery tried to pull her hand back, but the light had already reached her sleeve. Beneath her collarbone, the old scar opened into brightness. The brightness beneath Avery's collarbone did not flare like fire. It unfolded like something remembered. First came the crescent, thin and clean, curving over the place where the old pale scar had lived since childhood. Then a second line appeared beneath it, joining to the first with the slow precision of silver ink spreading across parchment. The room held its breath as the mark completed itself, a moon cradling a small crown, and within the crown, the unmistakable outline of a wolf's head lifted toward the sky. Avery had seen that symbol only in old portraits, carved into chapel doors, stitched into banners that servants were allowed to dust but never ask about. The first lunar sign. The royal moon blood. The thing people in Moonspire spoke of as history, not as skin. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the older alphas stood so quickly his chair scraped the stone. Another followed, not standing, but lowering himself to one knee before he seemed to realize his body had chosen before his mind did. The motion spread unevenly through the hall, a ripple of instinct and fear. Ladies dipped their heads. Guards dropped their eyes. A household officer made a sound that might have been a prayer and pressed 2 fingers to his chest. These were people who had watched Avery carry coal, scrape wax from floors, and fold their sheets with hands made rough from soap. Now they looked at the same hands as if they belonged to a shrine. Avery wanted to laugh, but nothing about it was funny. She wanted to cry, but even that felt as if it would be taken from her and named incorrectly. So she stood with her palm still resting on the silver bowl, the light pulsing under her skin in quiet waves, and felt only cold. Not wonder. Not triumph. Cold. Because reverence that arrived only after proof was not kindness. It was calculation learning a new shape. Across the room, Marissa Vale had gone very still. Her careful sadness vanished, leaving behind something bare and sharp before she remembered to hide it. The moonstones in her hair no longer looked like ornaments. They looked borrowed. Lord Gideon Voss closed the leather folder with both hands. The sound was small, barely more than paper meeting paper, but Rowan Sterling heard it. Avery knew he heard it, because his eyes moved to Gideon, with the exact stillness of a wolf noticing one. Wrong step in dry leaves. Explain, Rowan said. One word again, but this one did not close a door. It opened a locked room. Gideon bowed, slower than before. Your Majesty, relic responses can be distorted by proximity to sacred materials. The girl has worked in royal chambers. She may have been exposed to oils, ceremonial cloths, residual markings. No one believed him completely. Avery could feel that, too. The same room that had been ready to bury her now hesitated, because the lie had become expensive. The oldest elder beneath the moon arch rose with visible effort. His eyes were fixed not on Avery's face, but on the mark at her collarbone. Residual markings do not form the sovereign crest, he said. His voice trembled just enough to make the truth sound older than he was. Only direct blood does that. Direct blood. The words struck Avery somewhere below language. Her fingers tightened around the rim of the bowl, and the relic answered with another pulse of silver. For the first time since she had entered the hall, Rowan stepped down from the high table. Every gaze followed him, but he seemed unaware of them, or uninterested in granting their attention weight. He stopped several feet from Avery, close enough that she could see the faint line of strain beside his mouth, far enough that she did not feel crowded. "Avery Hale," he said, and he used her name differently than the elder had. "Not as a label. As a fact. Remove your hand from the relic." She tried. This time, the silver released her easily, like water letting go of a stone. The light remained at her collarbone, steady now, bright through the open edge of her plain brown dress. A murmur rose, quickly silenced when Rowan turned his head. "No one speaks until I ask for testimony," he said. The hall obeyed. Avery looked down at the mark and felt the strangest grief move through her, gentle and devastating. All her life, she had thought the silence inside her meant emptiness. Now the whole court was staring at that silence made visible, and not one of them could tell her who she had been before they decided she was nothing. Rowan did not ask Lord Gideon for another explanation. He turned to the oldest elder and said, "Bring the sealed birth ledgers from the lower archive. The ones from 23 years ago." The order moved through the hall like a draft, finding every hidden crack. Several faces changed at once, not enough for a careless eye to catch, but Avery had spent her life surviving careless rooms by noticing careful people. One elder lowered his gaze to his chain. A clerk near the witness rail pressed both hands against his book. Mrs. Calder covered her mouth, and for the first time that morning, Avery saw something in the housekeeper's eyes that was not pity. It was memory. "Your Majesty," Gideon said, his voice still even, though it had lost the polished warmth that made lies sound reasonable. "Those ledgers were damaged in the West Tower flood. The court has relied on verified copies for years." Rowan looked at him. "Then bring the damaged ones." No one spoke after that. 2 guards left through the side arch, and the waiting began. It was only minutes, perhaps less than 10, but to Avery it felt like standing inside a held note, the air stretched thin and silver around her. The mark beneath her collarbone had dimmed to a steady glow, no longer bright enough to hurt the eyes, but impossible to mistake for anything ordinary. She kept expecting it to fade, to become a scar again, to give the room permission to return her to the version of herself they understood. It did not. The guards returned carrying a narrow cedar box bound with 3 tarnished bands. Dust clung to the lid in grey seams. The oldest elder unlocked it with a key from beneath his chain, and the smell that rose from inside was dry paper, old smoke, and something faintly sweet, like lavender pressed between pages and forgotten. Avery knew that smell. Not from the archives. From the scrap of cloth she had kept under her mattress for 12 years, the only thing that had come with her in the winter carriage, pale blue wool, soft at the edge, embroidered with half a crescent in silver thread. She had never known why it made her feel less alone. The elder turned pages with trembling fingers until he stopped at one near the middle. A folded document had been pasted over the original entry. Not sewn. Not sealed. Pasted, as if someone in a hurry had trusted age to do the rest of the hiding. Rowan stepped closer. "Remove it." Gideon's face emptied. The elder looked once toward him, then took a small blade from the clerk, and lifted the edge with painstaking care. The false record peeled back slowly. Under it, in faded black ink, was another name. Not Avery Hale. Not Stray. Not Servant Ward. Seraphina Moonvale, daughter of Luna Helena Moonvale, born under the first frost, marked by sovereign moon blood. A second line had been scratched through, but not completely enough. Placed under hidden guardianship, until the restoration of the royal line. Avery read the words 3 times before they agreed to become meaning. Seraphina. The name did not feel like hers. It felt like a room she had been locked out of before she learned to walk. Mrs. Calder made a small sound, and every head turned toward her. She stepped forward before fear could stop her. Her hands shook so badly the grey shawl slipped from one shoulder. She came with a blue blanket, she whispered. There was a letter. I was told to burn it. Her eyes moved to Gideon, then away, as though even now looking at him too long might cost her courage. I did not. I hid it behind the laundry hearth. Gideon said nothing. That was when Avery understood the deepest part of the cruelty. They had not found an unwanted child and made her useful. They had taken a named child and taught her to believe she had never deserved one. Rowan's voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make the room lean toward it. Seal the doors. No one leaves this hall until every record bearing Lord Voss's hand is brought before me. Avery looked down at the glowing mark and felt no triumph, only the slow arrival of a grief too old for the girl she had been and too new for the woman standing there. The trial had been built to erase her. Instead, it had spoken the name they buried. The command to seal the doors did not make the hall feel safer. It made the truth feel trapped inside with everyone who had helped hide it. Guards moved to each entrance with quiet efficiency, and the click of iron bolts sliding into place traveled through. The great hall one after another, measured and final. Avery stood beside the white-draped table with the relic dimming at her fingertips and the name Serafina still ringing somewhere inside her, too formal, too bright, too impossible to fit into the small spaces where she had kept herself alive. Across the room, Lord Gideon Voss remained upright, his face pale but composed, as though dignity could be worn over exposure like a clean coat. Marissa Vale had retreated half a step behind the council rail, one hand closed around the moonstone circlet in her hair until her knuckles whitened. No one called Avery worthless now. That absence should have felt like victory. Instead it opened a hollow ache under her ribs. She had not become different in the last 10 minutes. Her hands were still rough from laundry soap. Her dress was still plain brown wool. Her cuffs were still damp. The only thing that had changed was that the room had been forced to learn a language it respected. Rowan Sterling stepped away from the high table and removed the black mantle from his shoulder. The movement was simple, but the court watched it as if he had drawn a border no one else was allowed to cross. He approached Avery slowly, stopping close enough for the warmth of the fabric to reach her before his hand did. "May I?" he asked. The question was so quiet that for a moment Avery did not understand it. Kings did not ask servants' permission in Moonspire. Nobles did not ask whether a girl in a stained work dress wanted to be covered while half the court stared at the glowing mark on her skin. She looked at him, expecting command beneath the courtesy. She found only restraint. So she nodded once. Rowan placed the mantle over her shoulders without touching the mark, the heavy cloth settling around her like night warmed by a hidden fire. It smelled faintly of cedar, snow, and the clean leather of riding gloves. The weight of it steadied her more than she wanted to admit. A murmur tried to rise from the tears, but Rowan did not even turn his head before it died. "The court will not examine her like an object," he said. "The mark has answered. The records have answered. Now the living will answer." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty, this matter requires private review. The girl is overwhelmed. She may not understand the implications of what has been revealed." Avery felt the word girl pass through the room and land where Worthless used to sit. Smaller, softer, but built from the same belief. Rowan looked at her before he looked at Gideon. "Do you want the hall cleared?" he asked. "You may have this continued privately. No one here has earned the right to your pain." The offer struck harder than any accusation had. Not because it solved anything, but because it left a door open and waited for her to decide whether to walk through it. Avery looked at Mrs. Calder, who had begun to cry without making a sound. She looked at Lila, the pantry maid, trembling beside the witness rail. She looked at the young guard, whose testimony had placed her in the records room, and whose shame now hung visibly on his face. Then she looked at Gideon, at the man who had helped build her life out of absence and expected her to be grateful for the floor beneath her feet. Her voice, when it came, was low but clear. "No," she said. The word moved differently this time. It did not ask to be believed. It simply arrived. "Let them stay." Rowan held her gaze for one breath, and something like respect, quiet and unadorned, passed between them. Then he stepped beside her, not in front of her, and faced the court. Avery drew the mantle closer around her shoulders. For the first time since dawn, she did not feel like someone being led toward judgment. She felt like someone deciding what judgment would mean. Avery did not speak first. That surprised the room more than if she had accused Lord Gideon at once. She stood beneath Rowan's black mantle, feeling its weight over her shoulders and the steady glow beneath her collarbone, and let the silence gather until every person in the hall understood she was no longer rushing to fit inside their patience. When she finally moved, it was only to place one hand over the place where the mark shone through the edge of her dress. "I remember a blue blanket," she said. Her voice did not echo, but it carried. "I remember being told not to ask why I had no family name. I remember a healer touching this scar, when I was 14, and looking at Lord Voss before he looked at me. I remember being sent to rooms moments before something went missing, then being blamed for standing where someone ordered me to stand. Small things. Servant things. The kind of things powerful people counted on being too ordinary to matter. But as Avery named them, they lined up with the ledger, the false paper, the wax seal, the too bright thread, and the frightened witnesses, until the story Gideon had built began to show its seams. Mrs. Calder stepped forward with the letter she had hidden for 12 years, brought from behind the laundry hearth by a guard Rowan had sent. The paper was smoke-stained at one corner, but the seal remained, the same crescent crown now shining on Avery's skin. The oldest elder read it aloud, his voice unsteady. It named a child placed under protection during a succession crisis. It named Helena Moonvale as mother. It named Gideon Voss as temporary guardian of the sealed record. The word temporary seemed to trouble the room most of all, because 23 years had passed, and Avery had spent every one of them being taught that temporary neglect was simply the shape of her life. Gideon attempted one final explanation. He spoke of political instability, of dangers to the royal line, of choices made for the kingdom's safety. Rowan listened without expression, until Gideon reached the word necessary. Then the king lifted one hand, and the hall became still. "A child's name is not a danger," Rowan said. "A servant's silence is not consent. A crown that survives by burying its own blood is not protected. It is ashamed." No one answered. There was nothing safe left to answer with. By sunset, the official record had been corrected in front of witnesses. Lord Gideon was removed from council authority pending full judgment under royal law. Marissa Vale's claim to lunar consideration was suspended after the false testimony was entered into the court roll. Lila and the young guard confessed they had been pressured and were placed under royal protection until the investigation ended. Avery expected relief to arrive cleanly, like a door opening to sunlight. It did not. It came slowly, in fragments. A cup of warm tea placed into her hands by Mrs. Calder. The return of the blue blanket, smelling faintly of ash and lavender. Rowan standing beside her while the clerk wrote Serafina Moonvale into the bloodline ledger, then quietly asking which name she wished spoken tomorrow. Avery looked at the ink drying beside the name that had been hidden from her and thought of the girl who had survived by answering to Avery Hale. "Both," she said. Months later, the old servants' wing beneath Moonspire was no longer used for storage and forgotten girls. Avery had ordered it remade into a protected house for packless children, widowed workers, and anyone whose records had been lost or stolen by convenience. The first morning it opened, she walked through the same lower corridor, where she had once scrubbed laundry water from her hands before trial. The stones were still cold. The stairs were still narrow. But lamps burned along the walls now, and every door had a nameplate. In the great hall above, Rowan waited beside the council table, not ahead of her, not behind her, but beside the chair marked with the crescent crown. Avery touched the moon mark at her collarbone, no longer to prove it was real, but to remember what it had cost to be seen. Then she stepped into the room, and this time, when the court rose, she did not lower her eyes.